Okay, good morning, campers.
Good morning.
Let's start with a quick prayer. In the Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. Lord, help us to learn more about you every day, and to follow you every day a little bit more closely, and eventually to join Jesus in heaven. Okay, I started with a quick prayer. I probably should have done that yesterday, but my talk is on the Constitution, a reverent view of the Constitution. And in order to talk about the Constitution, we really have to start talking about its foundations, which is the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are separated by 13 years. The Declaration of Independence is in 1776. Constitution, 11 years, is not written until 1787 and ratified by 1788. The Declaration of Independence is written really mostly by Thomas Jefferson. It's a committee, 5 guys: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And the fundamental clause on which our government is based, on which the Constitution was written, is this phrase here: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to preserve these rights, governments are instituted among men." It says 4 things, really. 1, there's a God, all right, a creator. The Declaration of Independence mentions God 4 times with different terms. It talks about divine providence and a number of other things. 1, there's a God. 2, God gave us rights, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And then they list them, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right? We have 3 basic kinds of rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property. And 4th, to preserve these rights, governments are instituted among men. We create government to protect our rights. That's the purpose of government. And we created our own government, and our revolution happened roughly the same time as the French Revolution. Excuse me. Now the French, it's a Christian country. Well, 98% Catholic, 2% Protestant Huguenot. They also had a revolution in 1789. 2 different outcomes. Why? The American Revolution was based upon the belief in Christ and those inalienable rights that God gave us. The leaders of the French Revolution had a different philosophy. The people had believed in God, but they believed their revolution was based upon the rights of man. No God was mentioned. They worshiped the goddess of reason. That's ultimately. So can we have rights without God? For a very short time, as we find out when we compare, I should say more contrast, the American Revolution with the French Revolution. The American Revolution is inspired by Christians who worship God, the one true God, and the English common law system of individual rights. The French Revolution had been co-opted by this order of Illuminati that had been created in 1776. It was broken up in Germany by the Bavarian police, but it had spread to France, and many of the Illuminist influences, the atheistic influences, took over the French Revolution. So atheists are in charge in France, even though the people still mostly believe in Jesus. And what's the difference? Well, the Americans sought a republic. They wanted a system of laws to stop one man from being in charge. They wanted individual rights to be protected. Even if the majority try to take away the rights of a minority, they don't want that. The French, they sought democracy, ruled by majority. They think this is going to protect rights. Turns out it doesn't. The American Republic creates liberty under law, even under the Articles of Confederation. There are individual rights protected by state constitutions. Later, the United States Constitution protects those rights. The French Revolution descends into anarchy, tyranny, and ultimately what's called the Great Terror, where thousands upon thousands of French people are put to death for believing in God, for exercising even the slightest disagreement with the French government. Ultimately, even Robespierre, who was one of the leaders of the French Revolution, he himself was guillotined The guillotine is an invention of the French atheistic revolution. They wanted to create what they called a humane death, an instant death. So they created an axe that would go down in a slide and chop the head off instantly. And they would have buckets and buckets of heads ultimately, because the state, no longer believing in Jesus, no longer believing in that there's a God who says, "Thou shalt not kill," they begin to worship a bloodbath. And it ends 15 years later. We have a new constitution with a Bill of Rights. We have peace. We have prosperity. We have growth. The French, they have a dictator, one man in charge, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he goes on a continent-wide conquest. He conquers almost all of Europe. He conquers France, Germany, all the way to Moscow. And then, eventually, he's defeated. Millions of Frenchmen die in that war. And the French nation is impoverished. There are widows, there are orphans. By the millions in France, the nation is defeated. Why? Because they didn't base their government on God, on the belief in individual rights. They ended in a dictatorship. Yesterday we talked a little bit about a total police state. Same basic thing. All right. When Reverend Kraft was talking last night about, it's important that you believe in Jesus, and it's important your government and your society be based in Jesus. We can see through history that there are consequences to ignoring God. The French Revolution, on its surface, sounded a lot like the American Revolution. There were a lot of American revolutionaries, people like Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. He went over to France and said, "It's just like us." Because he was an atheist, he didn't understand. But it wasn't like us. It was totally different. If there's no God giving you rights and you create a government, the government can take over and become the God. The government can then take over and take away your rights. If there's no higher power than you, then there's no limits on government. And this is what ends up in the police state or dictatorship. One person or a small group in charge with a front man. And so when they created the Congress, I'm not going into the Constitution in depth, especially Article 1, because I think that's going to be handled a little bit later. Or maybe it's already been done. Has the Article 1 talk been?
Next class.
Next class. Okay, so I'm going to summarize this very quickly. The Founding Fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, they said, let's keep most of the power out of the hands of one person. We need a unified executive, someone who can execute the laws quickly, who can fight a war quickly. But we don't want him to be able to take us into war. They could have looked at the example. They couldn't look at the example of Napoleon Bonaparte because he hadn't taken over in France yet, but he was about to. But they had many, many other examples in history. So they said, let's give Congress, the legislative branch, the power to decide whether or not to go to war. And in Article 1, Section 8, it says, Congress can decide whether we go to war, not the president. Not President Obama taking us to Libya or President Bush taking us to Iraq. They need approval from Congress. Only Congress makes rules for the military. President Obama says, I'm going to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's not his responsibility. Who punishes pirates? Congress. Who funds the military? Congress. Same thing. They're giving Congress all control over the money. This we got from England. In the English system, the Parliament controlled all the money, but the king decided whether or not England would go to war. And England was always at war, so they decided we don't want to do that here. But we kept that part of England's policy, where our legislative branch controls the power of taxes. And they said it's got to begin in the House of Representatives, and Congress can create any kind of a tax they want, but they have to be done, if it's a direct tax, if it's a tax on you just for being a person or your property, it has to be according to apportionment, according to your representation in Congress, your state's representation in Congress. If it's an indirect tax, it just has to be the same rate across the country. If it's on something that's conditional, something that you do, like if you, and you guys all pay taxes, even at your age, right? You go to the store, you buy a candy bar, or you go to Taco Bell and you buy a burrito, and a lot of times there's a tax. Not in New Hampshire, there's no sales tax. But if you go to out of state and you buy something, they're going to say, oh, and sales tax is an extra 5 or 6 or whatever percent. That's it has to be the same rate. If it's a federal tax, it has to be the same rate in every state. Every state also has their own taxes, all right? So they gave Congress these powers, especially a little bit more about the military power. This is a segment from the notes, Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. James Madison was the guy, he's our fourth president, he wrote the first draft of the Constitution. He also took the best notes at the convention when they were drawing up the Constitution. And he's talking, there's a little conversation here about who should bring us to war. If we have to go to war to defend the country, who should bring us? And Roger Sherman from Connecticut said, that they're talking about taking out Madison, and Gary said, take out declare war, or put in declare war instead of make war, because the executive's going to have to actually fight the war. The president's going to have to be the commander-in-chief during the war. So Roger Sherman says, yeah, that's pretty good. The executive should be able to repel and not commence war. In other words, if we have a sudden attack until Congress can meet, the president's got to be able to fight until Congress decides what to do. But as long as Congress is in session or capable of judging, the president has no power over a war. This is what we want. So they changed it to declare. And Elbridge Gerry said, I never expect to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. And yet, that's what we have here in America today. President Obama's already done it. And presidential candidate Mitt Romney has said, I don't have to go to Congress if I want to declare war on Iran. So the presidents aren't following the Constitution, so we need to be able to do that. Well, the Founding Fathers had a plan for their Constitution. They didn't want this dictatorship. They didn't want one group. So they had a real complicated way. They had basically 5 different safeguards. Basic safeguards they put into the Constitution. The first one is called separation of powers. And you guys all probably had this in middle school, right? There's the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, right? The legislative branch does what?
Makes laws.
Writes the laws. All the laws are made in the legislative branch. Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution says all legislative powers herein granted are in the legislative branch. The president doesn't make laws. Judges don't make laws. A lot of people say the Supreme Court has ruled and it's the law of the land. No. The Constitution is the law of the land. The law of the land is the law passed by Congress. The judges are supposed to say, in this instance, has it been applied? The executive branch carries out the laws. They enforce the laws. They're the guys that, the executive branches, think of it as a sheriff or a policeman. If you break the law, they go and arrest you. But they don't punish you. They're not allowed to punish you. The judicial branch judges. Because we don't trust the executive branch to always get the right guy. You guys saw last night. The president arrested some people and threw them in prison. Turned out, we had 2 examples, but there are many others. They had the wrong guy. The president thinks, well, he might be the wrong guy, and I'll get blamed if I let the wrong guy go. Well, no, that's why we have judges. That's why we have juries. We have a judicial branch to decide what is in the Constitution, what is the law. Has it been broken in this one instance? All right, the separation of powers. Another one thing that they did is they create these 3 separate branches, each with their own group, the House and the Senate. And they did this thing called checks and balances. Because what happens if the legislative branch just makes a law and then the president says, I don't want to follow that? What if the president says, well, you know what? I know Congress made this law. I'm going to make my own law. I'm going to just say, by my proclamation, I do this. Or what if the judges decide, well, I know this is the law, but that doesn't sound right to me. So I'm going to just do what I want. And I'm going to judge, I like this guy. I'm corrupt. You gave me some money, so I'm going to judge for you instead of the other guy. Well, they did these things called checks and balances. And they have, in our system different checks. Here's Congress, the legislative branch, President, Supreme Court, and states. Every single part of our federal government has a check against, or more than one check, against the other branches. Like Congress even checks itself. The other branches don't really check each other. I mean, the president doesn't stop himself. The Supreme Court doesn't really stop itself. But Congress does. The Founding Fathers wanted the most powerful branch of government to be the legislative branch. They wanted that to be the most powerful branch. So what they did was, they said, this is going to be really powerful, so let's split it in 2. And we'll give them different interests. You've got the House, which is voted on directly by the people. This represents the will of the majority. And we also have the Senate, which represents the states. All right? A senator is elected by the state. Originally was elected by the state legislature. So the Congress is checked against itself. But how does Congress stop a president that goes crazy and says, I'm going to do anything I want? Well, they have a number of things. They can impeach him. The House can impeach him, and the Senate can convict him and kick him out of office. 2 presidents have been impeached. Not one has been convicted, although President Nixon would have been convicted, so he actually resigned. They can amend the Constitution. They can pass an amendment, and they could even abolish the presidency by constitutional amendment. They can change the Constitution any way they want. All right? And they control funding. If the president says, I'm going to have my own little council on environmental quality, whatever it is, Congress can pass laws saying, no money goes toward that. So, if President Obama wants to have his own little private volunteers, he could do that, but can't use government money. Same thing with the judicial branch. Judges go crazy. There was a case where a judge took a bribe a couple years back, about 20 years ago. And what do you do with him? You impeached him, convicted him, and then he was later convicted in a court, sentenced to prison. And then the good people of Washington, D.C. elected him as their mayor afterwards. But they got rid of him as a judge, okay? The states, if the states start doing things that are against federal law and against the Constitution, Congress can pass a law to stop them. Same thing with the president. Congress passes a law he doesn't like, veto. But Congress can override the veto. How does the president influence the judiciary? He can't control their decisions, but he helps to appoint, with the Senate, the members of the judiciary. All right? He can also, if the judges make a bad decision, he can say, you get out of jail, you're free. Or he can even issue what's called a pardon, which says, under the law, you've never committed your crime. I give you a full absolution. So the president has a lot of power to stop bad decisions of the courts. And he can issue an executive order. If the states aren't following the law under the Constitution, he can say, I'm going to issue an executive order asking the executive branch, U.S. Marshal Service or whatever, to enforce the law under the Constitution. Supreme Court, what do? They're pretty much a one-trick pony for checks and balances. They say, unconstitutional, unconstitutional, unconstitutional if it is. All right? And then the states have even more checks than the 3 regular branches of government. They have the ability to run a constitutional convention without even Congress. 2/3 of the states say, we want a constitutional convention. They could abolish Congress. They could abolish the presidency. It's a very awesome power. One that is very dangerous in our time, but it is an important check the states have on the federal government. They can also nullify, as many of them are doing. When Congress passed a law saying the president can impose, put someone in prison without a trial indefinitely, the state of Virginia said, not in our state, and that goes back to Jefferson and Madison. They created nullification. They coined it. They said, we're not going to allow it to happen in our state. When in 1798, Congress passed a law saying, if you criticize the president, and there were a couple of editors, newspaper editors, who said, John Adams is a fat boy. They literally did. And then they were brought up on charges under the Alien and Sedition Act and put in prison. Some others were fined. And Virginia and Kentucky said, we're not going to do that. Not in our state. And eventually Jefferson was elected president and he pardoned everybody. Okay? The states have the ability to do, and of course they kind of check themselves, because if you don't like the laws in Massachusetts, you can move to New Hampshire. If you don't like the taxes in Massachusetts, you can move to, in fact, I used to joke, I'm from Massachusetts, I used to joke, every great tyranny has its refugees. You know, the Berlin Wall, they were the feet people who walked across the Berlin Wall and escaped. They were the boat people who escaped out of Cambodia. And New Hampshire has Massachusetts' SUV people. You know, they're fled Massachusetts and its high taxes and its high regulatory environment to avoid the state income tax. But there are checks and balances. This is the second of the 5 checks that they have. The third one is federalism. They put in the Constitution only a few things that the federal government can do. They take care of the few things that really the states can't do by themselves. National defense, border, interstate trade rules, banking, and a few others, okay? The states handle most of them. Someone out here, one of you guys decides you're angry with your sister and you stab her to death. I hope you don't. It's not a federal crime, but it's a state crime in every state. The federal government will not come after you for murder unless you go across a state border. The state will try you and convict you. Federalism means most of the law is on the state level. And a lot of the services are even below that. They're at the local or city or county level. All right? It's important to realize that what the Founding Fathers didn't want all power in one area, so they created different levels of government. There's a national government, state government, and local government. And they split up the government that way too. They didn't want one person in charge. All right? These are the 5 areas here, okay? Separation of powers, we talked about that. Legislative, executive, judicial. Checks and balances, there were tons of them. I didn't even list them all in that chart. There wouldn't have been enough room. Federalism, division of powers between 2 or more levels of government, the federal, state, and local, or the national, state, and local. And next, there's delegated or enumerated powers. This is a list of powers the government can't do, but can't go beyond. And you know, if you go to Article 1, Section 8, and you'll get a little bit more detailed on that later today, it's only a few things that the federal government can do. That means all of the many things that they could otherwise possibly do, they can't do it. You know? And I'm going to get to the, I've cut a video here last year. I'm going to play that in just a minute. The last thing is this. James Madison said, this is perfect. This is perfect. If we limit the government to just the things, a few things, that means everything else it can't do. If we say it can take care of national defense and interstate trade, that means it can't take away the freedom of religion. But a lot of people said, well, we don't trust government because they interpret everything way out of proportion. So we need a Bill of Rights with a list of things that they can't do, just to be sure. And that's a reservation of powers, or a Bill of Rights. A list of things the government can't do. That's the 5th check. That's the 5th thing. How do you stop government from getting all power? You got separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism. You say they can only do a certain number of things, and then they say, just to be sure, to double, you know, sort of redundant, here's a list of things you can't do, just to be sure. All right. I'm going to do this video here. I hope you guys will enjoy it.
Okay, Mom, I got it. Hey, Billy, listen to your mother. Make her proud. Okay, I got it.
Billy, you may use this card to withdraw money from the ATM or use as a check card to buy food, beverages, and gas, but only use our bank's ATM to avoid any fees. You may buy bread, you may buy milk, you may buy fresh veggies, you may buy fresh fruit, you may buy lean meat, you may buy fruit juice, you may fill the car's tank once, you may use the car when it is necessary to get the things on this list. P.S. You may not use the car or the card for any purpose other than the purposes that we have stated.
You gotta fight
Hey, there's $1,500 missing from the checking account.
Billy. What? Don't go out here.
They've been drinking and smoking.
What's this? As clearly as the Marlboros.
You need to explain yourself, mister.
Right now.
Well, you said I could buy food, so pizza and burritos is a type of food. And you said I could buy beverages with the card, and, well, beer and rum are obviously beverages. Gas, I figured you light a weed or some cigarettes and it puts out the type of gas.
Don't get smart with me.
I only used the card when I thought it was necessary. I went to the Red Sox game and buying my friends some popcorn and some hot dogs.
What do you think will happen to Billy? Right? His parents would be very unhappy and punish him for a long time. And while most parents across the country would do just that, sadly, Billy will most likely be re-elected. Congress also the same kind of listed powers under the U.S. Constitution, and they apply the U.S. Constitution exactly the same way Billy applied his mother's note. Congress has a short list of powers called the enumerated powers. Congress can raise an army and a navy, punish piracies in the high seas, regulate commerce among the states, set rules for bankruptcies, grant copyright and patents for a limited time, and a few others. But Congress does many, many things that are not authorized by the U.S. Constitution. Indeed, Mom's note to Billy resembled the U.S. Constitution in more than one way. Billy dishonestly tried to exploit what he saw as a loophole in Mom's note, permitting him to buy food, beverages, and gas. And Congress does the same thing with the Constitution's general welfare or commerce clauses. Mom left a list of things that Billy can do, just as the U.S. Constitution does. But Mom's note also contained an explicit prohibition on anything else being done with the car and the check card. Remember P.S. you cannot do anything that is not on the list? That's almost identical to the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which states that, quote, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Yet the Congress does a long list of things that are not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. The American people need to rise up, like Billy's parents are about to do, and demand that Congress, the President, and the courts follow the limits of the U.S. Constitution, or they will soon find that they have a government of unlimited powers, which is the textbook definition of totalitarianism. I want to thank all the stars here. Most of you guys are
Necessary.
There's a bunch of you guys here. This quote here, I put on in my PowerPoint. It's worth looking at in a little bit more detail. All right, and Madison, he noted something about the preamble of the Constitution. A preamble is simply this. I mean, a lot of people say preamble. What does that mean? You know, I mean, a lot of you guys are thinking that. What does preamble mean? It's kind of a new word, or it's a word you've heard, you never really thought of. What does it mean? And it's an introduction or a summary of what a constitutional clause will do, but not part of what it actually does. It's kind of a thing of like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you how to write your text. Okay? Then I go on to say, you may use blue or black pen. All right? Fair enough. Well, that's what a preamble is. Let's look at the U.S. Constitution's preamble. We sang it last night at campfire. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty in our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. Well, if this empowers Congress to do what it thinks is necessary for the common defense, promote anything it thinks is in the general welfare, meaning helping everyone's well-being, establishing justice, making a more perfect union, we don't need the rest of the Constitution. That's not what it's about. They're just saying, here's what we're going to do with the Constitution. Then they go into the Constitution and they say exactly what they're going to do. Okay? Let's think about it. Why would they say Congress shall have the power to raise an army and a navy if they already have the power to to do everything to promote the common defense. Same thing with some of the Bill of Rights. Here are two examples. Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, that's the preamble, says, hey, we want a well-regulated militia because the people have to bear arms to defend the state and each other. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In other words, here's what we're going to do and why, and this is us doing it. Government cannot infringe on your right to bear arms. Same thing, Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. All right? We want to stop unreasonable searches. It doesn't say if the government thinks it's reasonable, they can search it. No. It then goes into a test. It's a 4-part test. It says no warrant shall be issued. What's the first part? You need a warrant. If someone wants to search your property without your consent, they need a warrant. 1. But upon probable cause. All right, a lot of times police say, well, we don't search unless we have reasonable suspicion. That's not the constitutional standard. Probable cause. What does probable mean?
Most likely.
More likely than not. More than 50% chance. If I had a pair of dice and I took one of those die out and I said, will I probably roll a 6? What's the answer? No. Will I probably roll something other than a 6?
Yes.
Yes. All right. More than 50%. So that's the second test. You need more than a 50%. You need a warrant, and the warrant has to say it's more than a 50% chance you're going to do what's going to happen. Well, what next? But upon probable cause, supported by an oath or affirmation. Somebody has to put their, that's the third test. You need an oath. Somebody has to put their name and their reputation on the line. And then finally, describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. You can't just say, AJ is a scurrilous guy. You know, he's a bad person. If I search his house, I'm probably going to find something bad there. You can't do that. You have to say, I'm going to find this. I'm going to find, you know, as we saw earlier, we're going to find weed there, or we're going to find something there, okay? And I'm going to find it in that room, and that's what I'm going to find. You can't just say, yeah, you're a disreputable person, I'm going to search you. It's probably a good chance I'm going to get. No. You have to be specific about what you're going to find and who you're going to search. Okay? 4 tests. And you see, the preamble doesn't really do anything. It just basically says, here's why we're doing it. In James Madison, this is the quote at the end of the video, he says, the preamble of the Constitution, you know, if they could do anything they want, had this, where does he say it? He says, the preamble of the Constitution would admit a construction which would erect the will of Congress into a power paramount in all cases. In other words, if you can do anything in the case of a more perfect union, justice, common defense, you can do anything you want. That's total power. He says, you know, and he goes on to say, had the federal government been endowed with whatever they should judge to be instrumental towards union, justice, tranquility, common defense, general welfare, and the preservation of liberty, nothing would have been more frivolous than an enumeration of powers. What does frivolous mean?
Foolish.
Yeah, foolish, a waste of time. And what is enumeration of powers? When you enumerate something, what do?
List.
It's a list, okay? He says, why would we say you can do whatever you want and then go on and say all of these other things? Oh yeah, you can do whatever you want toward general union, whatever's promotes justice, and you can regulate the banks. Well, wouldn't some sort of a regulation of banks be part of justice? You can do whatever you want in the name of the common defense. Oh, and you can raise an army and a navy. And you can make rules for the Army and the Navy. And you can punish pirates. And you wouldn't list all of those things if you already gave that power. That's what James Madison is saying. He says, no, this is about enumerated powers. We wanted to limit the power of the government. That's why we listed the powers. All right. A couple more quick things, and I'm almost done here. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're almost out of time, too. Good. Question?
I was just gonna ask with what you were saying about the Fourth Amendment.
Yes.
But like when you were talking about like policemen having found probable cause, but I mean most of the policemen that we run into are not like federal police; they're state police, and would that still apply to the states?
Yeah, in some instances it would. The 14th Amendment says that states cannot take away any right guaranteed in the Constitution. The right against unreasonable searches and seizures is one, but the Supreme Court doesn't always uphold that. So, I mean, the answer to your question is maybe, or in some instances. All right? So the Founding Fathers have this Constitution. They have these 5 ways of keeping power out of the hands of one person. They write the Federalist Papers, there are 54 papers, written to urge people in New York to adopt it. If you were in my history class at Coyle Cassidy High School in Taunton, you'd have to read several of them in the course of your class. And even after they adopt the Constitution, they say, just to be sure, even though we've listed these things, we don't trust the government to limit itself really to those things. So let's put together another list of things they cannot do, and that's the Bill of Rights. And James Madison introduces it. 12 of them are introduced. They ratify 10 immediately, and then one more, which says that congressmen can't give themselves a raise until after an election is ratified in 1992. The other one's kind of still hanging out there. And you guys know them. Congress shall make no law establishing a national religion. And what this comes from is we can't have a national church. There are most of the states in the Union in 1789 and 1791 had a state church. We can't have a national church. I come from Massachusetts. In Massachusetts at that time, the Congregational Church was the official church of Massachusetts. They passed the First Amendment. It didn't stop the Congregational Church from being the official church of Massachusetts. 50 years later, in 1832, Massachusetts says, it's probably not a good idea to have a national church, and they amended their state constitution, and they changed it. But not because of this, because the operative word here is Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. It didn't stop the states. And even, prohibiting abridging the freedom of speech of the press. In the past, states were censored. In fact, that was the big thing. If a play had something salacious or immoral about it, they could get it banned in Boston, and then they